Sarah Martinez never imagined that a single gunshot would become the difference between life and death. When rescue teams finally found her after 32 hours in the Louisiana bayou, she was barely conscious, covered in mud and blood, clutching an empty rifle with shaking hands. The bullet she fired didn't kill anything. It saved everything. What happened in those lost hours would challenge everything experts thought they knew about human survival. This is the story of a woman who refused to disappear into the darkness of America's most unforgiving wilderness, and the desperate choice that brought her home. Sarah Martinez had always been the responsible one. At 34, she was the kind of person who double-checked her gas tank before long drives and always carried a first aid kit in her backpack. Her friends joked that she was overprepared for everything, but Sarah knew that preparation had saved her more than once. She never could have imagined that all her careful planning would mean nothing when faced with the vast, unforgiving wilderness of Louisiana's Atchafalaya Basin. The morning of September 15th started like any other hunting trip. Sarah had been planning this expedition for months, researching the best hunting spots in the basin and obtaining all the necessary permits. She was an experienced hunter, having learned from her grandfather when she was just 12 years old. Over the years, she had tracked deer through the forests of East Texas and taken down wild boar in the hill country, but the Atchafalaya Basin represented something different entirely. This was one of America's largest river swamps, covering nearly 1 million acres of wetlands, cypress trees, and waterways that stretched as far as the eye could see. Sarah's destination was a remote section of the basin that local hunters had told her about. According to the stories, white-tailed deer were plentiful in the area, and the isolation meant less competition from other hunters. She had studied topographical maps for weeks, marking her planned route with colored pencils and calculating distances between landmarks. Her truck was loaded with enough supplies for a 3-day trip. Freeze-dried meals, water purification tablets, extra batteries for her GPS device, and emergency flares. The drive to the basin took 4 hours from her home in Beaumont, Texas. Sarah left at dawn, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of pink and orange as she headed east on Interstate 10. The landscape gradually changed from the suburban sprawl of Houston's outskirts to the rural farmland and eventually to the dense forests that bordered the Great Swamp. She stopped for coffee and gas at a small truck stop in Lafayette, where the attendant warned her about the weather. "Storm system's supposed to move through tomorrow," the elderly man said, squinting at the horizon. "You might want to think about heading home early if you're planning to be out there." Sarah thanked him for the advice but wasn't concerned. Her GPS showed clear weather for the next 2 days, and she had weathered plenty of storms during her hunting trips. Besides, she had invested too much time and money in this expedition to turn back because of a few clouds. The final stretch of her journey took her down increasingly narrow roads until she reached the boat launch at Lake Fosse Point. This would be her entry point into the basin. She had arranged to rent a small aluminum boat from a local outfitter, a weathered man named Claude who had been guiding hunters and fishermen through these waters for over 30 years. "You sure you want to go out there alone?" Claude asked as he helped Sarah load her gear into the boat. "That's some serious country you're heading into. Easy to get turned around, especially if you're not familiar with the waterways." Sarah appreciated his concern, but she had always preferred hunting alone. She found that other people made too much noise and scared away the wildlife. Besides, she had her GPS, her satellite phone, and enough experience to handle whatever challenges the swamp might present. "I've got everything I need," she assured Claude, patting the waterproof case that contained her electronic equipment. "I'll be back by Sunday evening." Claude helped push the boat away from the dock and watched as Sarah started the small outboard motor. The engine puttered to life with a reassuring rumble, and she waved goodbye as she steered toward the maze of channels that led deeper into the basin. The last thing Claude would remember about that conversation was how confident she looked, sitting straight in the boat, with her rifle case secured beside her. The first few hours of Sarah's journey went exactly as planned. She followed her predetermined route through a series of connected waterways, stopping occasionally to consult her GPS and make notes on her waterproof map. The scenery was breathtaking. Ancient cypress trees draped in Spanish moss created a natural cathedral over the dark water, and she spotted several species of birds she had never seen before. A great blue heron watched her pass from a fallen log, its yellow eyes tracking her movement with patient curiosity. As the morning progressed, Sarah began to notice subtle changes in the landscape. The main channels gave way to narrower passages, and the GPS signal started to fluctuate. She wasn't worried at first. She had experienced similar issues in heavily forested areas before. The device would lose signal temporarily and then reconnect once she moved to a more open area. By noon, Sarah had reached what she believed was her intended hunting spot, a small island covered in oak trees that seemed perfect for setting up a blind. She beached the boat and spent an hour exploring the area, looking for signs of deer activity. The island showed promise. She found several game trails and fresh droppings that indicated recent animal activity. Satisfied with her choice, she returned to the boat to retrieve her gear. That was when she first noticed the problem with her GPS. The device showed her location as being several miles from where she thought she was, and the map display kept flickering between different views. She tried resetting the unit, but the same issues persisted. Even more concerning, her satellite phone was showing no signal at all, despite being in what appeared to be an open area with clear sky above. Sarah decided to stay calm and think through her options. She had been navigating by traditional methods long before GPS technology existed, and she still carried a compass and paper maps as backup. The problem was that the Atchafalaya Basin was unlike any terrain she had hunted before. Unlike the familiar forests of Texas, where landmarks like hills and roads provided clear reference points, the swamp seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, with few distinguishing features. She spent the afternoon setting up her camp and trying to get her bearings. Using her compass, she attempted to retrace her route back to the boat launch, but the maze of waterways made it difficult to determine which channel she had originally followed. Many of the passages looked identical, winding between cypress trees and thick vegetation that blocked her view of distant landmarks. As evening approached, Sarah made a decision that would prove to be crucial. Instead of attempting to navigate back to the boat launch in fading light, she would spend the night on the island and start fresh in the morning. She had plenty of supplies, and daylight would give her a better chance of finding her way out safely. She set up her tent in a clearing near the center of the island and prepared a simple meal on her portable camp stove. The sounds of the swamp at night were unlike anything Sarah had experienced before. The familiar hooting of owls and rustling of small animals was accompanied by the deeper calls of alligators and the splash of something large moving through the water nearby. She had researched the wildlife of the basin and knew that alligators were common, but hearing them so close to her campsite was unsettling. Sleep came fitfully. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness, and Sarah found herself checking her watch repeatedly. The temperature had dropped more than expected, and she was grateful for the extra blanket she had packed. Around 3 in the morning, she was awakened by the unmistakable sound of rain beginning to fall on her tent. When dawn broke, Sarah's situation had become significantly more challenging. The storm that the gas station attendant had warned her about had arrived ahead of schedule, bringing heavy rain and strong winds that made travel by boat dangerous. Even worse, the storm had disrupted what little GPS signal she had been receiving, leaving her completely dependent on traditional navigation methods. Sarah studied her paper maps by the light filtering through her tent walls. The Atchafalaya Basin was crisscrossed by hundreds of waterways, many of which connected to form complex loops and dead ends. Without reliable electronic navigation, finding her way back to the boat launch would require careful attention to compass bearings and landmark recognition. As she prepared to break camp, Sarah noticed that the water level around her island had risen noticeably overnight. What had been a narrow beach where she had pulled up her boat was now completely submerged. The boat itself was still secure, anchored in slightly deeper water, but the rising water was a clear sign that the storm was more serious than she had anticipated. Sarah made a critical decision. Rather than waiting for the storm to pass, she would attempt to navigate back to the boat launch using her compass and the general direction she remembered traveling the day before. The longer she waited, the worse the weather might become, and she was beginning to feel the first stirrings of genuine concern about her situation. Loading her gear into the boat in the rain was a miserable experience. Everything became soaked despite her efforts to keep her supplies dry, and the small outboard motor was reluctant to start in the wet conditions. After several attempts, the engine finally caught, and Sarah began her journey into the storm-darkened swamp. What she couldn't have known was that the rising water had already begun to change the landscape around her. Passages that had been clearly defined the day before were now wider and deeper, making them harder to recognize. New channels had opened up where the floodwater had found ways through the vegetation, creating false routes that led nowhere. Sarah was no longer just lost in the Atchafalaya Basin. She was lost in a version of the swamp that was transforming around her with each passing hour. The rain came down like bullets, each drop stinging Sarah's face as she tried to navigate through waterways that no longer matched anything on her map. The storm had transformed the familiar into the alien, turning what should have been a simple return journey into a nightmare of wrong turns and dead ends. Her small aluminum boat cut through the dark water, but every channel she chose seemed to lead her deeper into the maze rather than toward safety. Sarah had been traveling for 3 hours when she first admitted to herself that she was truly lost. The compass in her hand pointed steadily north. But north toward what? Every direction looked the same. Endless stands of cypress trees emerging from black water, their branches heavy with Spanish moss that dripped constantly in the rain. She had tried following her compass bearing for what should have been the direct route back to the boat launch, but twice she had found herself in dead-end sloughs with no way forward. The fuel gauge on her outboard motor showed less than half a tank remaining. Sarah had brought extra gasoline in jerry cans, but she hadn't expected to be running the engine for so many hours. At this rate, she would run out of fuel before nightfall, leaving her stranded wherever she happened to be when the engine died. The thought of spending another night in the swamp, this time without the option of moving to find shelter, filled her with a cold dread that had nothing to do with the rain soaking through her jacket. Around noon, the character of the storm changed. The steady rain gave way to violent downpours interspersed with periods of relative calm, and the wind began to gust with enough force to push her lightweight boat off course. Sarah found herself fighting to maintain control as she navigated increasingly narrow channels. Branches whipped across the water, and more than once she had to duck to avoid being knocked out of the boat by low-hanging limbs. It was during one of these wind gusts that disaster struck. Sarah was attempting to navigate around a partially submerged log when a sudden gust caught the boat and pushed it sideways into a tangle of cypress roots. The impact was violent enough to throw her forward against the steering console, and she heard the sickening crunch of fiberglass against wood. When she managed to back the boat away from the obstacle, she could see a jagged crack running along the hull just above the waterline. For now, the damage wasn't critical. The boat was still floating and the motor was undamaged. But Sarah knew that the crack would worsen with time and stress, and if the water level continued to rise, what was now a minor leak could become a serious problem. She needed to find shelter and assess the damage properly, but everywhere she looked, the landscape offered nothing but more water and more trees. Sarah's training kicked in as she forced herself to think systematically about her situation. She was lost, her boat was damaged, her fuel was running low, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. Her GPS and satellite phone remained completely non-functional, leaving her cut off from any possibility of calling for help. But she still had her survival gear, her rifle, and most importantly, her determination to get home alive. She began looking for any piece of high ground where she could beach the boat and wait out the worst of the storm. The problem was that in this part of the basin, true dry land was almost non-existent. Most of what appeared to be solid ground was actually floating masses of vegetation that could support small animals but would never hold the weight of a person. Sarah had read about people who had tried to walk on such false islands only to break through and find themselves trapped in deep water with no way to climb out. After another hour of searching, Sarah finally spotted what looked like a genuine island, a small rise covered in oak trees that appeared to be anchored to solid ground beneath the water. As she approached, she could see that the water around it was shallower, and fallen logs created natural barriers that might provide some protection for her boat. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best option she had seen all day. Beaching the boat required careful maneuvering to avoid further damage to the cracked hull. Sarah used the last of her forward momentum to slide the bow up onto a muddy bank, then waded into knee-deep water to pull the boat as far onto shore as possible. The water was shockingly cold, and she could feel the mud trying to suck her boots off with each step. By the time she had secured the boat with multiple anchor lines, she was soaked to the skin and shivering uncontrollably. The island was larger than it had appeared from the water, perhaps an acre in total, with enough high ground to set up a proper camp away from the rising water. Sarah dragged her gear up to a relatively dry spot beneath a massive oak tree and immediately focused on getting warm. Her hands were shaking so badly that it took 3 attempts to light her camp stove. But eventually she had hot coffee brewing and was beginning to feel human again. As she waited for the coffee to heat, Sarah examined her boat more carefully. The crack in the hull was worse than she had initially thought. It ran for almost 2 feet along the starboard side, and she could see that the fiberglass was completely separated in several places. With the right materials, the damage could be repaired, but she had nothing aboard that would work for a permanent fix. The best she could do was apply duct tape to the worst areas and hope that it would hold long enough to get her back to civilization. The afternoon brought a brief respite from the rain, and Sarah used the opportunity to explore her temporary refuge more thoroughly. The island showed signs of previous human habitation. She found the remains of an old fishing camp, including a collapsed cabin and the rusted skeleton of an airboat. Whoever had built the camp had chosen their location well. Even with the storm surge, most of the island remained above water. Among the ruins of the fishing camp, Sarah made a discovery that lifted her spirits considerably. Hidden beneath a pile of rotting boards, she found several items that previous visitors had left behind. A waterproof container holding emergency flares, a rusty but functional machete, and most valuable of all, a hand-drawn map of the local waterways. The map was old and water-stained, but it showed details that didn't appear on her official charts. Shortcuts between channels, shallow areas to avoid, and most importantly, multiple routes back to the main shipping channel. Sarah spent an hour studying the hand-drawn map and comparing it to her official charts. The person who had created it clearly knew these waters intimately, and several of the marked routes looked like they would cut hours off her journey back to the boat launch. The only problem was determining her current location on the map. Without GPS coordinates, she would have to rely on recognizing landmarks and estimating distances traveled. As evening approached, the storm returned with renewed fury. The wind howled through the oak trees above her camp, and Sarah could hear the continuous sound of branches breaking and falling into the water. She retreated to her tent and spent the remaining daylight hours planning her route for the following morning. Using the hand-drawn map as a guide, she identified 3 possible routes back to the main channel, each with its own advantages and risks. The night brought new challenges that Sarah hadn't anticipated. The storm surge had continued to rise, and by midnight, water was lapping at the edges of her campsite. She was forced to move her tent twice during the night, each time to higher ground that turned out to be only temporarily above the flood level. By dawn, she was camped at the highest point of the island, surrounded by water on all sides, and watching nervously as the flood continued to rise. More troubling was the realization that her boat was no longer securely anchored. During one of her tent relocations, she had discovered that the rising water had refloated the boat, and it was now drifting against its anchor lines. The damaged hull was taking on water at an alarming rate, and she spent an hour in the pre-dawn darkness bailing water and readjusting the duct tape repairs. When full daylight finally arrived, Sarah faced a critical decision. The continued rise in water level meant that her island refuge would soon be completely submerged. She could wait and hope that the storm would pass and the water would recede, but there was no guarantee that would happen before her supplies ran out. Alternatively, she could attempt to navigate back to safety using the hand-drawn map, knowing that her damaged boat might not survive the journey. The decision was made for her when she discovered that several of her food supplies had been contaminated by floodwater during the night. What had been enough provisions for several days was now reduced to perhaps 1 day's worth of edible food. Sarah realized that waiting was no longer an option. She had to leave the island while she still had the strength and resources to travel. Preparing to depart took longer than expected. Every piece of gear had to be checked for water damage, and the boat required constant bailing to keep it from sinking at the makeshift dock. Sarah prioritized her most essential items: the rifle and ammunition, her remaining food and water, the hand-drawn map, and the emergency flares she had found among the ruins. Everything else would have to be left behind to reduce weight and give the damaged boat the best chance of staying afloat. The outboard motor started on the first pull, which Sarah took as a good omen. She had perhaps 4 hours of fuel remaining, which should be enough to reach the main channel if she could follow the most direct route, shown on the hand-drawn map. The problem was that many of the landmarks indicated on the map were no longer visible above the flood level, making navigation a matter of educated guesswork rather than precise route finding. Sarah pushed off from the island with a mixture of relief and apprehension. She was finally taking action to save herself, but she was also leaving the only solid ground she had found in over 24 hours. Behind her, the oak trees that had provided shelter were now standing in water almost to their lowest branches. Within hours, her island refuge would be completely submerged, leaving no trace that it had ever existed above the flood. The hand-drawn map that had seemed like salvation the night before became a source of mounting frustration as Sarah tried to match the crude sketches with the flooded reality around her. Every landmark the map indicated was either completely submerged or so altered by the rising water that it bore no resemblance to the original drawings. What the map showed as a large cypress with split trunk was now just another tree trunk poking above the waterline, indistinguishable from dozens of others. The rock pile near Bend had vanished entirely beneath the flood. Sarah's damaged boat was fighting her every mile of the journey. The crack in the hull had opened further despite the duct tape, and water was seeping in faster than she had anticipated. Every 15 minutes, she was forced to stop the engine and bail frantically with a plastic container, trying to keep ahead of the rising water in the boat's bottom. Each stop cost precious time and fuel, and she could feel her margin for error shrinking with every passing hour. The storm had settled into a steady, driving rain that reduced visibility to perhaps 50 yards in any direction. Sarah found herself navigating from tree to tree, unable to see far enough ahead to plan her route effectively. The narrow channels that the map indicated as shortcuts had become hazardous obstacle courses filled with floating debris, branches, logs, and unidentifiable objects that could damage her already compromised boat beyond repair. 3 hours into her escape attempt, Sarah encountered her first major navigation error. Following what she believed was the correct channel according to the hand-drawn map, she found herself in a long, straight waterway that seemed to match the map's description perfectly. But after traveling for over a mile, the channel ended abruptly in a wall of vegetation with no visible outlet. She had followed what turned out to be a false lead, wasting precious fuel and time in a dead-end slough. The psychological impact of this mistake was almost as devastating as the practical consequences. Sarah had been operating on the assumption that the hand-drawn map was accurate, and that her careful planning would eventually lead her to safety. The discovery that she could still make critical errors in interpretation shattered her confidence and forced her to confront the possibility that she might not find her way out at all. Backtracking through the false channel took another hour and consumed fuel she could not afford to lose. By the time Sarah returned to what she hoped was the correct route, her fuel gauge was showing nearly empty, and the water in the boat's hull was rising faster than ever. She was now bailing water every 10 minutes, and each session required longer to clear the accumulated flood. It was during one of these bailing sessions that Sarah first heard the helicopters. The sound came from the north, muffled by the rain and wind, but unmistakably the distinctive thump of rotor blades. Her heart leaped with hope as she realized that someone was conducting search and rescue operations in the area. She immediately reached for the emergency flares she had found at the abandoned fishing camp. The first flare ignited properly, sending a bright red trail high into the gray sky before exploding in a brilliant burst of color. Sarah watched anxiously for any sign that the helicopter crew had spotted the signal, but the aircraft's sound continued moving in the same direction, without any apparent change in course. She waited several minutes before firing a second flare, this one angled more toward the direction the helicopter had been traveling. The second flare seemed to have no effect either. The helicopter sounds faded into the distance, leaving Sarah alone once again with only the rain and her struggling outboard motor for company. She had used 2 of her 4 remaining flares with no apparent result, and she needed to conserve the rest for situations where she had a better chance of being spotted. The failure of the flare signals marked a turning point in Sarah's ordeal. Until that moment, she had maintained hope that her situation was temporary and that rescue was simply a matter of time. But the helicopter's failure to respond to her signals forced her to accept that she was truly on her own. No one was coming to save her. She would have to save herself or die trying. This realization brought with it a strange sense of clarity. Sarah stopped trying to follow the increasingly useless hand-drawn map and instead began navigating by pure instinct and survival logic. She looked for the widest, deepest channels on the theory that they were more likely to connect to major waterways. She avoided areas where the current seemed sluggish, reasoning that flowing water had to be going somewhere. Most importantly, she began paying attention to subtle clues that she had been ignoring in her focus on map navigation. The wildlife, she noticed, seemed to be moving in consistent directions. The few birds she could spot in the storm were generally flying toward the southwest, and floating debris in the water appeared to be carried by currents flowing in the same direction. Sarah decided to trust these natural indicators and adjusted her course accordingly, abandoning the hand-drawn map entirely in favor of following the flow of the water itself. This new strategy seemed to work initially. The channels she chose were broader and deeper, making navigation easier and reducing the risk of running aground or hitting hidden obstacles. The current was noticeably stronger, which suggested that she was moving toward larger bodies of water rather than deeper into the maze of smaller waterways that had trapped her. But Sarah's damaged boat was reaching the limits of its endurance. The crack in the hull had now opened to nearly 3 inches at its widest point, and no amount of duct tape could stem the flow of water pouring in. She was bailing constantly now, barely keeping ahead of the flood, and her arms ached from the repetitive motion of scooping and dumping water over the side. The outboard motor chose this critical moment to begin showing signs of distress. The engine started missing irregularly, coughing and sputtering before returning to normal operation. Sarah recognized the symptoms of water contamination in the fuel system, a common problem in wet conditions that could lead to complete engine failure if not addressed. But she had no way to drain and clean the fuel system while floating in the middle of a swamp, so she could only hope that the motor would continue running long enough to reach safety. As afternoon faded toward evening, Sarah was forced to confront the possibility that she would spend another night in the swamp. Her fuel was nearly exhausted, her boat was slowly sinking, and she had seen no sign of civilization or rescue throughout the entire day. The temperature was dropping again, and she was soaked to the skin despite her rain gear. Hypothermia was becoming a real concern, especially if she ended up in the water when her boat finally succumbed to the damage. The decision of where to stop for the night was made for her when the outboard motor finally quit completely. One moment she was puttering along at quarter throttle trying to conserve the last drops of fuel, and the next moment the engine died with a final sputter and refused to restart. Sarah found herself drifting in complete silence except for the sound of rain on water and the steady drip of water entering her boat through the damaged hull. She was in the middle of a relatively wide channel with no obvious shelter in sight. Using the small paddle she carried for emergencies, Sarah managed to work the boat toward what appeared to be a slightly shallower area near a stand of cypress trees. But going was exhausting. The boat was heavy with accumulated water, and every stroke of the paddle seemed to move her only inches closer to potential safety. By the time Sarah managed to reach the trees, it was nearly dark, and her boat was more than half full of water. She tied off to a sturdy cypress trunk and spent the next hour frantically bailing water, trying to keep the boat from sinking completely. Even with constant effort, she could only slow the rate at which water was entering the hull. It was clear that the boat would not survive another day of travel, even if she somehow managed to get the engine running again. Sarah faced her darkest hour as she sat in the damaged boat, surrounded by black water and towering trees that disappeared into the rainy darkness above. She had no motor, no reliable shelter, and no way to signal for help. Her food was nearly gone, and her chances of being found by accident were virtually zero. For the first time since becoming lost, she seriously contemplated the possibility that she might not survive this ordeal. But even in her despair, Sarah's survival instincts continued to function. She inventoried her remaining resources, the rifle and ammunition, 1 day's worth of food, a few energy bars, her camping gear, and the 2 remaining emergency flares. She also had the machete she had found at the abandoned fishing camp, which could serve as both tool and weapon if necessary. Most importantly, she had her knowledge and experience, gained through years of hunting and outdoor activities. As the temperature continued to drop, Sarah realized that her immediate priority had to be warmth and shelter. Hypothermia could kill her faster than hunger or thirst, and she was already showing early symptoms: uncontrollable shivering, and difficulty thinking clearly. She needed to get out of the wet boat and find or create some form of dry shelter, even if it was only temporary. Using her flashlight sparingly to conserve the batteries, Sarah explored the area around her moored boat. The cypress trees created a natural windbreak, and she found several spots where fallen logs and accumulated debris had formed platforms that were partially above water level. Using the machete, she began cutting branches and Spanish moss to create a makeshift shelter on the most stable platform she could find. The work was exhausting and dangerous in the darkness, but it gave Sarah a sense of purpose and accomplishment that helped combat her growing despair. By midnight, she had constructed a crude but functional lean-to that provided protection from the rain and wind. Her sleeping bag was still dry thanks to its waterproof stuff sack, and for the first time in 2 days she was able to get warm and stop shivering, lying in her improvised shelter, listening to the rain drumming on the branches above her head. Sarah began planning for what she knew would be her final attempt at escape. Without a working boat, she would have to find another way out of the swamp. The idea that had been forming in her mind throughout the evening was both desperate and dangerous, but it was the only option she could see. Tomorrow, she would begin walking through the swamp, carrying only the most essential supplies, and hoping to find her way to high ground or a major waterway where rescue might be possible. Dawn brought no improvement in Sarah's circumstances, only a clearer view of how desperate her situation had become. The water level had continued to rise during the night, and her makeshift shelter was now surrounded by floodwater that had crept to within inches of her sleeping bag. Her boat had finally succumbed to the damage and was sitting on the bottom of the channel, with only its gunnels visible above the surface. Everything she had left in the boat was now underwater and most likely ruined. Sarah knew that waiting for rescue was no longer a viable option. She had been missing for over 36 hours, and while search teams were undoubtedly looking for her, the storm had made aerial reconnaissance impossible and ground searches extremely difficult. Even if rescuers were actively searching the basin, the vastness of the area meant that they could spend weeks looking without finding her. She had perhaps 1 day's worth of food remaining, and the rising water was forcing her to constantly relocate to higher ground that might not exist much longer. The decision to abandon her shelter and attempt to walk out of the swamp was the most frightening choice Sarah had ever made. Everything in her experience told her that staying with her boat and shelter was the safest course of action. Lost hunters were taught to stay put and wait for rescue, not to strike out on foot through unknown terrain. But those rules had been written for normal circumstances, not for someone trapped in a flooded wilderness with no reliable way to signal for help. Sarah spent the morning carefully planning her walking route and deciding what equipment she could carry. Every item had to be evaluated for its survival value versus its weight. The rifle was essential, not only for protection from wildlife but also as a potential signaling device. The remaining emergency flares were obvious choices, along with her knife, compass, and what little food she had left. Her camping gear was too heavy except for her sleeping bag, which she could use for warmth if she was forced to spend another night outdoors. The most difficult decision involved her water supply. Sarah had several bottles of fresh water remaining, but they were heavy, and she would need to travel light to make any meaningful progress through the swamp. She compromised by taking 2 bottles and filling a third with water from the swamp, along with purification tablets that would make it safe to drink if she ran out of clean water. It was a calculated risk. Dehydration would kill her faster than mild water contamination. Before leaving her shelter, Sarah used her last working pen to write a note describing her situation and her intended route. She placed the note in a waterproof bag and tied it securely to the highest branch she could reach, hoping that if search teams eventually found this location, they would have some indication of where she had gone. The act of writing the note forced her to confront the possibility that this might be her final message to the outside world, and she found herself adding personal messages to her family that she had never intended to write. The first steps away from her shelter were among the hardest Sarah had ever taken. Despite all its limitations, the lean-to had represented safety and security, the only stable point in an increasingly chaotic situation. Walking away from it felt like severing her last connection to civilization and committing herself completely to the uncertain mercy of the swamp. Sarah's plan was to head generally southwest, following the direction that the water seemed to be flowing, and hoping to intersect a major waterway or reach the edge of the basin where she might find roads or settlements. She carried her compass in one hand and used a long stick to probe the ground ahead of her, testing for solid footing and checking the depth of the water she would have to wade through. Progress was agonizingly slow. What appeared to be solid ground often turned out to be floating mats of vegetation that could not support her weight, forcing her to backtrack and find alternative routes. The water was rarely less than knee-deep and frequently rose to her waist or chest, making each step an exhausting effort that sapped her strength and body heat. Fallen logs and debris created obstacles that required careful navigation to avoid injury. The wildlife of the swamp was more active than Sarah had expected, and several encounters reminded her that she was far from the top of the food chain in this environment. She startled a large alligator that had been resting on a partially submerged log, and the massive reptile slid into the water with a splash that sent waves in all directions. Sarah froze until she was certain the animal had moved away, then gave the area a wide berth before continuing her journey. More troubling were the snakes. Sarah encountered several large specimens that she could not identify, some swimming through the water and others draped over branches at eye level. Her knowledge of Louisiana's venomous snakes was limited, and she was forced to treat every encounter as potentially dangerous. The constant vigilance required to watch for wildlife while also navigating through the difficult terrain added another layer of stress to an already overwhelming situation. By midday, Sarah had traveled what she estimated to be perhaps 2 miles from her starting point. The effort had exhausted her, and she was forced to rest on a fallen log that provided a temporary dry seat. Her legs were numb from the cold water, and she could feel the early stages of trench foot developing from the constant immersion. Even worse, she was beginning to recognize landmarks that suggested she might be traveling in a large circle rather than making progress toward safety. The psychological impact of this discovery was devastating. Sarah had assumed that by walking in a straight line, according to her compass, she would eventually reach the edge of the swamp or intersect a major waterway. But the flooding had created new connections between previously separate water systems, and she was finding herself channeled into routes that seemed to curve back on themselves. Without reliable landmarks, she had no way to confirm her suspicions, but the familiar-looking stand of cypress trees suggested that her morning's effort might have accomplished nothing. It was during her rest stop that Sarah heard the helicopters again. This time, the sound was closer and seemed to be following a systematic search pattern rather than simply passing through the area. Sarah immediately prepared to fire one of her remaining emergency flares, but the thick canopy of trees above her meant that the aircraft would have to be almost directly overhead to spot the signal. She waited tensely, tracking the sound as it moved closer to her position. The helicopter passed within what seemed like a few hundred yards of Sarah's location, but the signal flare she fired was completely obscured by the forest canopy. She watched in frustration as the red glow disappeared into the branches above her without ever breaking through to open sky, where it might be visible to the search crew. The sound of the aircraft faded into the distance, leaving her with the crushing knowledge that rescue had been so close and yet completely unattainable. Sarah's second attempt with the emergency flare was her last. She had misfired the flare in her haste and excitement, and it had exploded harmlessly against a tree trunk only 20 feet away. She was now down to her final flare, which she vowed to save for a situation where she had clear sky above her and a genuine chance of being spotted by aircraft. The helicopter encounter marked a turning point in Sarah's mental state. The near miss with rescue had been emotionally devastating, but it had also provided confirmation that people were actively searching for her. Someone knew she was missing, and they were devoting significant resources to finding her. This knowledge gave her the motivation to continue fighting for survival even as her physical condition continued to deteriorate. The afternoon brought new challenges as Sarah attempted to continue her journey through the flooded swamp. The water level had risen even higher, and areas that had been merely difficult to navigate in the morning had become completely impassable. She was forced to climb over and under fallen trees, sometimes crawling through spaces barely large enough for her body, while trying not to damage her rifle or remaining supplies. The cold was becoming a serious problem. Despite her physical exertion, Sarah's core body temperature was dropping due to the constant immersion in cold water. Her hands were so numb that she had difficulty gripping her walking stick, and her decision-making abilities were clearly impaired by the early stages of hypothermia. She found herself making obvious navigation errors and having to backtrack repeatedly when she walked into dead ends that should have been apparent from a distance. As evening approached, Sarah was forced to confront the reality that she would spend another night in the swamp. She had made perhaps 4 miles of progress during the entire day, but much of that distance had been offset by wrong turns and backtracking. More importantly, she was nearing the limits of her physical endurance. Her legs were cramping from the constant effort of walking through water and mud, and she was beginning to stumble frequently as fatigue overwhelmed her coordination. Finding shelter for the night proved to be even more difficult than the previous evening. The rising water had eliminated most of the elevated areas she had identified during the day, and Sarah was forced to settle for a precarious perch in the fork of a large oak tree. Using her sleeping bag and the few remaining pieces of her gear, she created a makeshift hammock that would keep her out of the water but provided little protection from the wind and rain. Sleep was impossible under such conditions. Sarah spent the night in a state of semi-conscious exhaustion, dozing fitfully between periods of adjusting her position to prevent herself from falling into the water below. The temperature dropped well below freezing, and she could feel ice forming on the exposed metal parts of her rifle. By dawn, she was suffering from severe hypothermia and had begun to experience the confusion and disorientation that marked the condition's advanced stages. It was in this desperate state that Sarah made the decision that would ultimately save her life. As dawn broke over the flooded swamp, she realized that her traditional survival strategies were no longer working. Walking through the swamp was too slow and too dangerous, and she was rapidly losing the strength needed to continue. She needed a completely different approach, something dramatic enough to attract attention from the search team she knew were looking for her. Sarah had one advantage that she had not yet fully utilized: her rifle. The sound of gunfire could travel much farther than visual signals, especially in the flat terrain of the swamp where sound could carry for miles without obstruction. If she could create a distinctive pattern of shots, something that would clearly indicate human activity rather than random hunting, she might be able to attract the attention of search teams even if they were too far away to see her location. The decision to use her rifle as a signaling device was not made lightly. Once she fired the shots, she would have reduced ammunition for protection against wildlife or other emergencies. But Sarah had reached the point where dramatic action was necessary. She was dying slowly from hypothermia and exhaustion, and conventional survival tactics were not going to save her. It was time to take a calculated risk that might mean the difference between life and death. The morning of Sarah's third day in the swamp began with a decision born of desperation and the clarity that sometimes comes when all other options have been exhausted. As she sat shivering in her makeshift tree shelter, watching the gray dawn light filter through the Spanish moss, she knew that this would be her last chance to survive. Her body was shutting down from hypothermia and exhaustion. Her mind was growing increasingly cloudy, and she could feel herself slipping toward the point where she would no longer have the strength or coordination to help herself. Sarah's plan was simple but required precise execution. She would fire her rifle in a specific pattern. 3 shots, pause. 3 shots, pause. 3 shots repeated at regular intervals. This pattern was the international distress signal, recognizable to any search and rescue personnel who might hear it. The key was timing. She needed to fire the shots when aircraft were in the area, but she also needed to conserve enough ammunition to repeat the signal multiple times if necessary. Climbing down from her tree shelter was an ordeal that took nearly 30 minutes. Sarah's legs were so weak and numb that she could barely support her own weight, and she had to rest frequently during the descent. When she finally reached the water level, she nearly collapsed from the shock of the cold water on her already hypothermic body. Every instinct told her to climb back up to relative warmth and safety, but she forced herself to continue with her plan. Sarah waded through chest-deep water to the most open area she could find, a wide channel where the tree canopy was broken, and sound would have the best chance of carrying to distant listeners. The effort of moving through the water while carrying her rifle and remaining gear pushed her to the edge of her endurance, but she managed to reach a position where she had a relatively clear view of the sky above. The waiting was torture. Sarah knew that helicopters had been searching the area, but she had no way to predict when they might return or what search patterns they were following. She stood in the cold water, rifle ready, listening for any sound that might indicate approaching aircraft. Every noise, the splash of an alligator, the call of a bird, the rustle of wind in the trees, made her heart race as she wondered if it might be the sound of rescue approaching. Hours passed without any sign of aircraft. Sarah's condition continued to deteriorate as she waited, and she began to question whether her plan would work at all. The hypothermia was affecting her thinking, making it difficult to concentrate or maintain focus on her surroundings. Twice she thought she heard helicopters that turned out to be nothing more than wind or her own imagination. She was beginning to hallucinate, seeing movement in her peripheral vision that wasn't there when she turned to look directly. It was just after noon when Sarah finally heard the unmistakable sound of a helicopter approaching from the east. This time there was no doubt. The rhythmic thump of rotor blades was growing steadily louder and seemed to be heading directly toward her location. Sarah raised her rifle and waited, Knowing that she would have only one chance to signal effectively before the aircraft moved out of range, the helicopter appeared through the trees as a flash of orange and white, clearly a search and rescue aircraft rather than military or civilian transport. Sarah could see that it was flying a systematic search pattern, moving slowly and relatively low as the crew scanned the flooded landscape below. She estimated that the aircraft would pass within a quarter-mile of her position, close enough for the sound of gunfire to be clearly audible to the crew. Sarah fired her first sequence of 3 shots, spacing them carefully and aiming into the air to ensure maximum sound dispersion. The sharp crack of the rifle echoed across the water and through the trees, creating the distinctive pattern that any search and rescue team would recognize as a human distress signal. She paused for exactly 10 seconds, then fired the second sequence of 3 shots. After another pause, she fired the final 3 shots of her first signal attempt. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Sarah could see the helicopter change course almost before the echo of her final shot had faded. The aircraft turned sharply toward her location and began flying in tight circles, clearly trying to pinpoint the source of the gunfire. Sarah fired another complete 9-shot sequence, this time adding her last emergency flare to provide a visual reference point for the approaching aircraft. The flare arced high above the trees before exploding in a brilliant shower of red sparks that was clearly visible even in the daylight. The helicopter crew had their target now, and Sarah could see the aircraft descending rapidly toward her location. She continued firing single shots every few seconds to help guide the aircraft to her exact position, using up the last of her ammunition in the desperate hope that rescue was finally at hand. What happened next was both miraculous and terrifying. The helicopter arrived at Sarah's location but immediately faced the problem that had made her rescue so difficult. There was nowhere to land. The flooded swamp provided no solid ground that could support the aircraft, and the tree canopy was too dense for the helicopter to hover close enough to deploy rescue equipment effectively. Sarah watched in growing panic as the helicopter circled overhead, clearly trying to figure out how to reach her. She could see crew members in the aircraft windows, and she knew they could see her. But the practical challenges of extracting someone from the middle of a flooded swamp were proving to be nearly insurmountable. For a terrifying few minutes, it seemed possible that she would be found but not rescued, left to watch her salvation disappear into the distance because of circumstances beyond anyone's control. The solution came from the helicopter crew's experience and training. Rather than attempting a direct rescue, they began clearing a path through the tree canopy, using the aircraft's rotor wash and specialized equipment. Sarah could see crew members rappelling down through the broken canopy, carrying chainsaws and other tools needed to create a landing zone. The noise was incredible. The combination of the helicopter's engines, the chainsaws cutting through branches, and the crash of falling timber created a chaos of sound that seemed to shake the entire swamp. It took nearly an hour to clear enough space for the helicopter to land safely on a makeshift platform of logs and debris that the rescue crew assembled in the water. During this time, Sarah remained in the water, supported by a flotation device that one of the first rescuers had brought to her. She was barely conscious, drifting in and out of awareness as hypothermia and exhaustion took their final toll on her body. The actual rescue was a blur of activity that Sarah would remember only in fragments. Strong hands lifting her from the water, the sensation of being wrapped in warm blankets, the incredible noise of the helicopter as she was loaded aboard. She remembered the face of the paramedic who worked on her during the flight to the hospital, a kind woman with gentle hands who kept talking to her, even though Sarah was too weak to respond. The flight to the medical center took only 20 minutes, but it represented a journey from the edge of death back to the world of the living. Sarah slipped into unconsciousness shortly after takeoff and didn't wake up until 2 days later in a hospital bed, surrounded by family members who had feared they would never see her alive again. The doctors told her later that she had been within hours of death when the rescue team found her. Her core body temperature had dropped to dangerous levels, and she was suffering from severe dehydration despite being surrounded by water. The infections from her extended immersion in swamp water would take weeks to fully heal, and she had lost nearly 15 pounds during her 3-day ordeal. But Sarah had survived, and the story of her rescue became a textbook example of how quick thinking and determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The helicopter crew that rescued her nominated her for a Civilian Courage Award, noting that her use of the rifle as a signaling device had been the key to her survival. Without that single decision to fire the distinctive distress pattern, they might never have located her in the vast expanse of the flooded Atchafalaya Basin. The investigation into how Sarah had become lost revealed that the storm had been far more severe than anyone had anticipated. The National Weather Service issued a formal apology for the inadequate warnings that had failed to convey the true danger of the weather system. Changes were made to search and rescue protocols for the basin, and new GPS beacons were installed throughout the area to help future visitors navigate safely. Sarah eventually returned to hunting, but never again to the Atchafalaya Basin. She became an advocate for improved safety equipment and emergency protocols for outdoor enthusiasts, sharing her story with hunting groups and outdoor organizations across the country. The rifle that had saved her life was retired to a place of honor in her home, a reminder of the 3 days when a single shot had meant the difference between life and death. The shot that saved everything wasn't the one that brought down game or defended against a predator. It was the shot that pierced through the vast indifference of the wilderness and said clearly and unmistakably, "I am here, I am human, and I refuse to disappear." In the end, that refusal, backed up by skill, determination, and one perfectly timed pull of a trigger, had been enough to bring Sarah Martinez home from the edge of the world.